So our main focus today in this talk is to discover the underlying common structure of paradoxes. So here's the breakdown for today's talk. We're going to start with one of the most popular attempts in capturing the common structure of paradox, namely the enclosure schema. We're going to argue that the enclosure schema is both too narrow and too broad. I'm going to explain the too narrow and too broad arguments shortly. And then after arguing against the enclosure schema, we're going to present our own positive theory of what do we need for a paradox to arise. We're going to start by observing the liar and the carry and see why do they arise, and then try to figure out what the ingredients of making a paradox is. And then we apply the recipe to various paradoxes. And finally, we learned the lessons from the recipe itself, how to discover more paradoxes using the recipe itself. And what does it have to say about truth tellers and pathological loops and the Sorites? And finally, conclude with what possible uniform solutions does the recipe suggest, right? So starting with the enclosure schema, again, Graham Priest attempts to find the underlying common structure of paradoxes using the enclosure schema. The schema itself involves a set omega, a two-unary predicate, a one-place function that satisfy the following condition. First, there is a set omega such that omega is set of all x such that x is phi, and psi of omega. And two, if x is a subset of omega and psi of x, then delta x is not in x. That's what he calls transcendence. And delta x is in omega, and that's what he calls closure. Once you get transcendence and closure, then you can fit certain paradoxes into the enclosure schema. So to explain this part, let's look at an example of the liar. So let omega be the set of all true sentences, and let psi be the property of being definable in the sense that there is a name referring to the given set. And let delta be a function that takes a subset of x of omega to a sentence that says of itself that it is not in x. Now suppose delta x is in x. Since it is in x, it is true because x is a subset of the set of true sentences. But delta x is the sentence that says that it is not in x. Hence, using the T schema, delta x is not in x. We got a contradiction from our supposition. Therefore, by reductio, delta x is not in x. We got transcendence. And by the T schema, from this delta x is not in x, we can conclude that delta x is not in x is true. But that's exactly what delta x is. So in other words, delta x is true. And in other words, delta x is in the set of all true sentences omega. And we got closure. And the liar occurs in the limit case when x is omega. And we get the contradiction of the form delta omega is in omega and delta omega is not in omega. Right? So this is an example of how the liar fits into the enclosure schema. One important thing to note about the enclosure schema is that Carey's paradox does not fit the enclosure schema. In a joint paper by Priest with Weber, Ripley, Hyde, and Colloquium, they claimed that Carey's sentence with a false consequent fit the enclosure schema, but not a Carey sentence with a true consequent. And that is because we cannot make the contraposition move in a Carey sentence with a true consequent to get transcendence. So a Carey sentence with a true consequent, you can only get closure, but you cannot get transcendence, and hence it doesn't fit the enclosure schema. So I want to show you first how a Carey sentence with a false consequent fit the enclosure schema. So again, we let the set omega to be a set of all true sentences. We let delta x to be S1 is says that if S1 is in x, then snow is not white, for example. We want a false consequent, right? Now the function delta x is clearly defined, and the set omega exists. If we take a subset x of omega, suppose delta x equals S1 and S1 is in X, then it follows that S1 is true, right? Because X is a subset of true sentences. And so S1, if S1 is in X, implies that snow is not white, which gives us snow is not white by modus ponens, right? We have S1 is in X. By discharging the supposition, we get the full sentence without the assumption. So S1, if S1 is in X, then snow is not white. Or in other words, S1 is true. In other words, S1 is in omega, since omega is the set of all true sentences. So we have closure. But since S1, if S1 is in X, it implies that snow is not white, is true. So if S1 is in X, we get that snow is not white, is true. But it is not the case. We know that snow is white. So by contraposition, since snow is white, we can conclude that S1 is not in X. And that's what we want, transcendence. Note here that we relied on outside information by using the information that snow is white. We're going to come back to the point of outside information later on. But one important thing to note here is that we cannot make that contraposition move if the consequent was true, because we cannot say, but it is not the case that snow is white, for example, right? Again, the limit contradiction arises when omega is X, right? So among other paradoxes that fit the enclosure schema, as we're going to see later on, that the Sorites also fit the enclosure schema. As a result, Graham Priest and his enclosure schema received a glut of objections for not including Kerry in the same family of paradoxes as the liar, and a heap more of objections for including the Sorites as the same family of paradoxes as the liar. We're going to argue in the same vein. We're going to argue that Kerry should be of the same family as the liar, and the Sorites should not be in the same family as the liar. And we're going to show that more general trivializing case can creep in if, for example, the Sorites is in the same family as the liar, or is an enclosure paradox. So let's start with the too narrow argument. We're going to show that the liar and the Kerry are patently related. Well, first, it's obvious that both are self-referential. They employ truth predicate, they rely on T-schema, and crucially, they involve ungroundedness. But someone might argue that, well, there's a huge difference in the Kerry is negation-free, while the liar is not negation-free. And we're going to argue that's not really the case. Even though Kerry occurs in negation-free languages, it's still very negation-y. Right? To prove that point, let's look at what Rashed first calls negative modalities. Let M be a one-place connective. M is said to be a negative modality if and only if for any A and any B. If we have A implies B, we can validly conclude that MB implies MA. We call M here a negative modality. It's not hard to see how negation is a negative modality, right? We start with A implies B. We use right negation rule for A and left negation rule for B, and we get not B implies not A. So negation fills the shoe of M, and it is a negative modality. Similarly, R of I for any phi, which is used in the Kerry sentence, is also a negative modality. So we start with A implies B. We use right arrow rule and left arrow rule to get B implies phi entails A implies phi, right? So R of I is also the same thing as M here, is a negative modality, right? So even if you say that RFI is not negation, it still works as a negative modality. But we're going to argue more that it is a lot like negation. We're going to come back to negative modality later on when we spell out our recipe, because it's going to play a crucial role. Right? So RFI behaves a lot like negation. RFI obeys the Morgan law. RFI behaves as how triple negation does. So if you have 3 RFIs, you can go to 1 RFI and vice versa. It obeys the law of excluded middle and partially behave like double negation does, in the sense that if you have A, then you can conclude A implies phi, but not the other way around. You do not have double negation elimination like for RFI, right? But that's a lot like negation, even if it doesn't have double negation elimination, right? For instance, the negation in intuitionistic logic lacks double negation elimination, but we still think it is a negation. It's not fair to call it intuitionistic logic negation free. So in a sense, the point here is that even though it looks like negation doesn't play a role in carry sentences, it is creeping in, regardless of the nature of phi, right? Regardless whether phi is true or false, it behaves like negation, right? We're going to make another argument that bridges the gap between the liar and carry. So consider the sentence mu that says, if mu is true, then mu is not true. Now the question I want to ask, is this a carry or is it a liar? Or is it something else in between? Because it centrally fits the carry schema. So if I am true, then something, right? But it also has an embedded liar in the consequent. Moreover, we can construct a proof of carry-like paradox using this sentence, and we can construct a proof of a liar-like paradox using the same sentence. I'm not going to go into the details of the proof, but all we need to notice is here we can prove the consequent, and the moves are very similar to a carry paradox. We're not using any new moves. It's just right arrow rule and left arrow rule, along with transparency, contraction, and cut. And we get to proving the consequent of the sentence itself, right? But we can also keep on going after proving the consequent of the sentence itself. We can keep on going to prove the negation of that sentence and get into the empty sequence the way we do the liar, right? So now the question comes back again. Do we count it as a carry or do we count it as a liar? If we count it as a carry, then we have a carry sentence that explodes. But that's uncharacteristic of carry, because in carry, it trivializes logic in the sense that you can have a schema where you can put anything in the consequent and you prove that sentence. It doesn't, usually you don't reach the empty sequence with a carry sentence. If we count it as a liar, then we have a sentence that clearly fits the carry sentence, but we treat it differently than other carry sentences. Moreover, if we count it as a liar, then if we adjust mu's consequent to be mu is true, then the adjusted mu would not fit the enclosure schema. So if we count mu, our regular mu, as a liar, then the liar definitely does not fit the enclosure schema, because there are instances where it does not fit the enclosure scheme. Otherwise, different treatments would already beg the question, since we would be assuming that the liar and the carry are different before applying the enclosure schema. All right. So the point from this part is to blur the line between the carry and the liar. Recall earlier that we said a carry sentence with a true consequent does not fit the enclosure schema. That's the claim that Weber and others, Priest included in the joint paper, made, right? We claim that there is a way for a carry with a true consequent to fit the enclosure schema, but with a significant cost. So suppose we do, we have a sentence S2 that says, if S2 is true, then snow is white. This is the opposite, or it has the opposite consequent of S1, as we've seen earlier. But we know that S1 fits the enclosure schema. So we know that, for example, we have closure for S1, right? So while doing the proof for S2 on why it fits the enclosure schema, we look at closure for S1, namely that S1 is in the set of omega. And we also have, if S1 is in omega, then not A is in omega, or snow is not white is in omega. By modus ponens, we can conclude that snow is not white is in omega. And hence, by classical logic, since snow is not white is in omega, then snow is white cannot be in omega. We use this information to do our counterposition move to get transcendence that we need. So we relied on outside information, right? In both cases, we relied on outside information. The first one, we relied on the information that snow is indeed white. The second one, we relied on the information that the first one fits the enclosure schema, or the carry sentence with a false consequent fit the enclosure schema. As a result, we use that information to fit a carry sentence with a true consequent to fit the enclosure schema. But being able to fit a carry sentence with a true consequent into the enclosure schema, using a carry sentence with a negated consequent should not be surprising. Because after all, we can get to the empty sequent with two carry sentences where the consequent is the negation of the other, right? So a proponent of the enclosure schema is left with three options. They can either reject that even a carry sentence with a false consequent fits the enclosure schema, and Priest seems to lean that way in more recent papers. He seems to have realized that we rely on the outside information to fit a carry sentence with a false consequent into the enclosure. Or we can claim that Carey's paradox fits the enclosure schema and bite the bullet on the ad hoc importation of outside information, or reject the enclosure schema altogether. We're going to claim that the best option is to reject the enclosure schema altogether, and here's why. If the enclosure schema does not accommodate Carey's paradox, even when we have a false consequent, then the enclosure schema is miscalibrated, since we have shown how the liar and the Carey are closely related. If Carey sentences with false consequents fit the enclosure schema, then Carey sentences with true consequent must also fit the enclosure schema, as we have just shown, right? Though the only way to do so is if we relied on outside information, and that is a very expensive ask. As we're going to see later on in our recipe, the recipe does not make any outside or extra relevant assumptions. The logical system should not be able to distinguish whether a sentence or a consequent of a conditional, in this case, is true or false. Our recipe does exactly that. It deals with the carry even when the truth value of the consequent is left entirely unspecified, because the carry is paradoxical regardless whether the consequent is true or false. It's not paradoxical because you can prove false things, but it is paradoxical because you can prove things out of thin air, right? So that's the too narrow argument. On the other hand of the spectrum, we will argue that the enclosure is too broad. One indication that the enclosure schema is too broad is that the Sorites fit the enclosure schema. Yet the Sorites is far more removed from the liar and other paradoxes of self-reference. It's way different than the liar than the carry as compared to the liar. So let's see first how the Sorites fit into the enclosure schema. Let P be a vague predicate, whatever your favorite one, is a heap, is bold, is tall. Let omega be the set of all x such that x is P. And let a sequence of objects where at least the first object is P and at least the last object is not P. Now, if you take a subset x of omega, then there must be a first member of the sequence not in x. since we have a sequence of objects that are ordered, right? Let this be delta x. So delta x is the first object, not an x. Hence, delta x is not an x. That's how we defined it. So we got transcendence, right? Now, since all members of X are P and delta X comes right after them, delta X is P as well, due to the principle of tolerance. The principle of tolerance say, if a member of a successive sequence satisfies P, then its successor must also satisfy P. And hence, delta X is in omega. We got closure. And we get the contradiction at the limit case when omega equals X, right? We claim that this is a disadvantage for the enclosure schema. The Sorites first does not involve a truth predicate or the T schema, but that's okay. There are related paradoxes to the liar that do not use the T schema or truth predicate. But more importantly, it does not rely on self-referential sentences or ungrounded sentences, right? In fact, the too broad problem can be seen in a more general way. In fact, the enclosure schema can be trivialized in two different but related cases. So let's look at the first general trivializing case. And Priest mentions this case. He says, take any contradiction of the form PA and not PA, where A is a singular term referring to a particular object. Let omega be the set of all y such that y is P, and let psi x be x equals omega. Let our delta function be a constant function where it takes you always to A. So delta omega equals A. Now, because of the first conject of the contradiction, we know that A is P. And hence, delta omega, which is our A, is in omega. We got closure. Because of the second part of the contradiction, we know that A is not P. Or in other words, delta omega is not in omega. We got transcendence. Now, we made a very general contradiction that's not necessarily a paradox to fit the enclosure schema right away. But we want our schema to be more strict about it, right? And Priest responds to this trivializing case by saying we want not just any old pattern, but the essential pattern. For genuine satisfaction of the schema, we need the fact that a contradiction fits the pattern to explain why the contradiction arises. So we need that explanatory value. And as for the previous example, that the pattern is satisfied can hardly therefore be used to explain why the contradiction arises. But that points out the main problem with the enclosure schema. So by Priest's own admission, the schema itself does not distinguish between different patterns, many of which are unrelated to the target family of paradoxes. He requires more than the schema itself. One has to further check whether the fact that the contradiction fits the pattern explain why the contradiction arises. But this is a serious lacuna. One wants the schema to provide enough structure so that by itself it explains why the contradiction arises, and thereby shed some light on the structure of paradoxes, right? So in the aforementioned trivializing case, we did not utilize any subset X of omega. We jump straight to using omega as an argument for our function delta. But there's a different trivializing case where we retain all the subsets X of omega. The trick, again, we have a constant function for our delta. So our delta is going to pick a specific object regardless of the input. Additionally, what we need to make this trivializing case is a set S and two prima facie convincing arguments where one argument says O is in S and another argument that says O is not in S. So to illustrate this trivializing case, take your favorite Zeno's paradox. I'm thinking of the dichotomy version here. So if you have a 100-meter runner who wants to finish a 100-meter race, in order to cover the 100-meter race, they must first cover half of that distance. So they must first cover 50 meters. In order to cover 50 meters, they must cover first half of that distance, so the first 25 meters, and so on ad infinitum. So the runner could not even begin to move, right? This suggests that motion is impossible. But we also have another argument that motion is indeed possible. Just look at the runner run. They can indeed, through common sense, be able to begin to run, right? To see how Zeno's paradox fits into the enclosure schema, let omega be the set of all moving objects, and let A be our 100-meter runner. And for any x that is a subset of omega, let delta x be that A. So again, A is a constant function that takes you to our 100-meter runner. So now the argument above shows that motion is impossible, right? Our 100-meter runner cannot begin to run. Therefore, our runner is motionless. In other words, delta x is not an x. And hence we have transcendence. However, there's another argument. You can see the runner run through common sense or begin the run. So our runner is belongs to the set of moving objects, and hence we get closure. This shows that the enclosure schema is too broad to capture a specific structure of paradox. So Priest noticed this, maybe not Zeno's paradox in particular, but in general, he noticed that it is problematic to have a constant function. So in both of them, both of the trivializing cases, the constant function, our function delta was a constant function. The value of delta didn't depend on its argument. So a proponent of the enclosure schema, like Priest himself, would claim that the value of the function delta must depend on the argument. But then again, the need for dependence points to what's lacking in the enclosure schema. Until we have an account of this dependence, the schema itself will not provide the structure of target family of paradoxes. That being said, even if the value of delta depended on its argument, we can still do a similar paradox for Zeno to fit the enclosure schema. So now we let omega be the set of all non-moving objects, and let x be a subset of omega, and let our delta x, now we don't want it to be a constant function, but to choose the heaviest object outside of x. The heaviest object is not an interesting or relevant dependence, but it is a dependence. And there's no specification in the enclosure schema to say it has to be a certain dependence. So now delta x is not an x by definition, our delta. We said the heaviest object outside of x. So we have transcendence. And now delta x is either a non-moving object or a moving object. If it is a non-moving object, then it's already in omega. If it is a moving object, then we apply Zeno's argument. So because every object is motionless, delta x is motionless. Therefore, delta x is in omega. So in either case, we get delta x is in omega, and we got closure. In fact, there's nothing special about Zeno's paradox, right? We can do it with any paradox. We can do it with the omnipotence paradox. I'm going to skip this because the reasoning runs exactly the same as the previous slide, except we let the set be the set of all omnipotent beings. And we ask the question, can delta x create a stone too heavy for any being to lift, including delta x itself? And the same thing would fit the enclosure schema. So the point again, formally speaking, there's nothing in the enclosure schema itself that requires a contradiction fitting the pattern to explain why the contradiction arises. And there's nothing that requires that the value of the delta function to depend on its argument or how that dependence relation work, right? In other words, Priest himself requires more than the schema can supply by itself. Until these requirements are built into the schema itself, the schema will remain too broad to capture the structure of specific family of paradoxes. So one would have hoped for more structure to be built into the enclosure schema itself. As we will see shortly, our recipe does exactly that. It builds the kind of structure that limits the pattern to the family of paradoxes in question. In other words, it is the job of the theory of paradox to tell us why and how something is paradoxical, and not the other way around. Right, so this concludes of why the enclosure schema is not the best theory of paradox. Now we're going to present our own positive theory of paradox. But before presenting our recipe or the ingredients of our recipe, let's notice how the carry and the liar arise. So for the carry and the liar, we do not need full transparency to construct the paradox. All we need is partial transparency. By that, I mean, we need the rule T1. So if we can prove phi, then we can prove that phi is true. And phi is true entails phi, right? We can also rewrite T2 as the following, as a rule, but currently we're using it as a schema. But either way, they are equivalent. So we're going to use it this way unless we otherwise specify. So what do we mean by there's no full transparency? It means we don't have the other direction of T2, or in other words, we don't have this. In other words, for example, if you take color theory implies that snow is white, we can conclude that color theory implies that snow is white is true. But this seems a bit maybe controversial, because color theory does not concern itself with how the truth predicate behave or with linguistic matters. All cares about colors, for example. But again, we're not here to argue against full transparency. I use it in my logic. All we want to show is that you don't need full transparency to construct the paradoxes. So having these rules, and by letting lambda is not true, we can construct the liar paradox. It looks exactly like your regular liar paradox, except the only difference is that it's a little bit longer because we don't have full transparency. So we use our truth rules, we use negation rules, right and left, and contraction and definition of lambda. We eventually get to prove lambda and prove its negation to get to the empty sequence, and with the help of cut, right? I'm going to be more careful later on why this happened. But this is just a preliminary look at the liar. Similarly with the carry, let kappa be, if kappa is true, then absurdity. In fact, it doesn't have to be absurdity. You can put anything in the consequent. It's, again, your regular carry. The only difference is slightly longer. And the end of carry, you reach, you prove the consequent, right? Out of thin air. All right. So here's what we need for the recipe. We need a predicate similar to the truth predicate that has these two rules. Again, if you prove phi, then you prove that phi is p, and phi is p entails that phi. Second, we need what we're going to call partial negative modality as compared to negative modality of Rustall's that we talked earlier. By partial, I mean we don't need the whole thing. We're only going to concentrate on A, getting it to the other side, right? But the only difference here is that in our M, we want the predicate P to appear there somewhere, right? So we start with A and empty on the right-hand side of the sequent and reach MA on the right-hand side. I'll explain this with examples, which makes it more clear. So a partial negative, so that's the second step. We need a partial negative modality M that uses such predicate. So in other words, that is a use of P occurs in M. And third, we need a diagonal lemma if we're using something like Gödel coding to let a sentence be its partial negative modality. So having these three ingredients of the recipe, the special rules for a predicate, or a predicate that has these two special rules, a partial negative modality, and then the ability to let a sentence be its partial negative modality, which we'll use diagonal lemma here, right? Having these rules would construct paradoxes. So let's explain why how step 2 and step 3 occurs in the liar and carry. So first, step 1, we've seen already occur because step 1 uses the truth predicate, and the truth predicate has these two special rules, right? So the partial negative modality used in the liar, we start with lambda. We use T2 and cut. In fact, cut is not needed if we use the other format of T2. And then with a negation rule, a right negation rule, we can get lambda is not true. So our A here is lambda. Our MA is lambda is not true. In other words, our M is something is not true. That's a partial negative modality. On the other hand, for the carry, we start with kappa. Again, you can start with any letter that you'd like. We can use weakening. Since we're using weakening, that means we can put anything in terms of the consequent of the carry. Doesn't have to be a false sentence, it could be a true sentence. But again, our A here is kappa, our MA is, if kappa is true, then absurdity. So our M is, if something is true, then absurdity. So this fulfills step 2 for the liar and the carry. This tells us that if we want to find any paradoxes, we just try to find partial negative modalities. Step 3, using the diagonal lemma, we can let lambda be its partial negative modality. Lambda is not true, and let kappa be its partial negative modality. If kappa is true, then absurdity follow. From there, we can construct the paradoxes, right? So maybe the question still remains, why does having the predicates, the predicate with two rules, T1 and T2, along with letting a sentence be its partial negative modality, create a paradox? And that's a good question, right? So if we take the liar, for example, in the liar, we use T2 and right negation rule in finding its partial negative modality, right? So that means we can do the same thing in our proof of the liar, but the only difference is that we're going to start with the rule of identity. So we're going to have an extra lambda on the right. But knowing that we have the diagonal lemma, we let a sentence be its partial negative modality. That means we can reduce our big sentence into lambda itself and use contraction. In other words, what we're doing really is using these rules, the same rules used in the partial negative modality, we can get lambda to teleport to the other side without affecting it whatsoever, without adding or removing any connectives on lambda, right? From there, you can contract. And then once you contract, you know you have lambda alone on its right-hand side. That means you know you can use T1 and get it to the other side. And then again, the same steps again. And finally, you can cut and get to the empty sequence. And all of the paradoxes, such as the carry or the paradoxes we're going to see along the ways, work in a similar fashion, right? Defining a sentence by its partial negative modality, along with the special predicate rules, allow us to teleport sentences from one side of the sequence to the other side of the sequence, right? So let's take other examples. Let's look at the provability predicate. It is safe to say we want the probability predicate to have these two rules, P1 and P2. Well, for now, I'm going to say it's safe. I'm going to show you why it's not safe to have P2. It's not safe in terms of getting paradoxes, right? So if you can prove phi, then we can conclude that you can prove that phi is provable. And if phi is provable, it implies that phi, right? These are reasonable rules to have. Again, we don't have full transparency. if we had full transparency, then we have the opposite of P2, where phi entails phi is provable, or in other words, every true sentence is provable, but that's counterintuitive because, for example, the Goldbach conjecture might very well be true, but unprovable, right? So we don't want the opposite of that. But again, we don't need full transparency to construct paradoxes. So let's find some random partial negative modalities. By random, I mean, let's do the same thing that we did with the truth predicate, but this time with a probability predicate. So instead of saying I am not true, it says I am not provable. Same thing with a carry version. If I am provable, then absurdity follows, right? They are the same moves as the ones we have seen. It's just different predicate. We know we can use the diagonal lemma to let theta be its partial negative modality and let gamma be its partial negative modality. As a result, for example, for the sentence that says I am not provable, we can get the probability liar. I know this sentence is the same sentence used in Gödel's first incompleteness, but it's not. This doesn't show you the first incompleteness because in the first incompleteness theorem, we don't have P2. In other words, you would not be able to prove theta nor not theta. But this shows you that if you have P2, then you can get into a paradox. You can get theta and not theta, similar way as the liar, and you get to the empty sequent. Moreover, for the carry version, which is Lop's theorem, we let gamma be, if gamma is provable, then absurdity. The proof follows exactly like carry, where we get to absurdity. This is used in Lop's theorem as a step towards second incompleteness. We're not going to go into details, but the main idea is that if you have a rule like P2, then anything will be provable. So it will be, your system will be trivial. But we're not going to go into details about the second incompleteness. But these are paradoxes that are just like the liar and carry. Same thing can be done with the predicate is known or is knowable. So if we can prove phi, then you can prove that phi is known because we have a proof for it. If phi is known, then it's better be true, right? Again, we don't have the other direction because not all true sentences are known or knowable. So we do not want full transparency for no, but we don't need it to construct the paradoxes. We get similar as the liar with a different predicate, similar as carry with a different predicate. Again, using the diagonal lemma, we can let them be their partial negative modalities, and we get the same paradoxes, again, with a different predicate. We get the knower paradox and knower carry, right? So what about the validity carry? Because it looks like it's a different beast, right? Because it is a two-place predicate. But we're going to argue it's really not that different. We're going to expand our recipe a little bit to include two-place predicates. So V1 is going to be, if you can prove that alpha implies beta, then you can prove that beta is valid from alpha. And V2 says if beta is valid from alpha, then it entails alpha implies beta. These are nothing new if you've read Beal and Mercy's paper, because there are VP and VD. We just pushed alpha to the other side using right arrow rule, just to make it more to fit our recipe, but they are equivalent. So having these rules, so the validity predicate has the same rules as we talked in the recipe. Let's try to find the partial negative modality. We start with V, implies nothing. Using weakening, we can put anything here. And then with an arrow rule and then validity rule, V1, we can get P is valid from V. Using the diagonal lemma, we can let V be its partial negative modality. and then a paradox just like carry occurs. Again, it occurs because it has the same ingredients. It's just a different clothing. Similarly with heterological or autological, and then we kind of define heterological. I'm gonna go quickly through this because the next paradox is exactly the same. This is a true two-place predicate. We say if we can prove that if we can prove that alpha is phi, then phi is true of alpha, and phi is true of alpha entails that alpha is phi. So we're using a two-place truth predicate here, right? And then we can find a partial negative modality, which is a heterological sentence, right? So using a diagonal lemma, we can let a sentence be the heterological sentence. So in other words, we can let a sentence say of itself that it is, or a heterological, the sentence saying heterological is heterological, and you get a paradox from that. Again, I went quickly through this because it's exactly the same as Russell's paradox in terms of extensions. So if we let this to express alpha is in the extension of phi, and we often state the membership schema as alpha in the extension of phi if and only if phi applies to alpha, or alpha is phi. But again, we do not need full transparency. We can use, just as the recipe tells us, only partial transparency for the membership rules. So if we can prove that alpha is phi, then we can prove that alpha is in the extension of phi, and alpha in the extension of phi entails that alpha is phi. From there, we can find a partial negative modality, but again, we're starting with a predicate here because that's what we use in the Russell's paradox. Using this and along with the membership rules, we can get alpha is not in the extension of ray, starting with ray, right? Or starting with alpha is ray to alpha is not in the extension of ray, but alpha here is arbitrary, so we can replace it with anything that we want. So we can get the extension of ray in place of alpha. So we can say the extension of ray is not in the extension of ray. From there, we get a Russell's paradox in terms of extensions, right? Because it's going to be in the extension of ray is going to be in the extension of ray. At the same time, the extension of ray is going to be not in the extension of ray. From there, we can get to the empty sequence. This paradox looks exactly the same as the heterological before, with the same moves, just different predicates. Right, there's a lot of paradoxes. The point here is that we can discover new paradoxes just by using the partial negative modality. So for example, let's look at what we're going to call an alternative liar. So the negation of tau is true. Let that sentence be tau. So instead of saying I am not true, it's going to say my negation is true, kind of thing. It is indeed a partial negative modality, but we use T1 instead of T2, and we use the negation rule first. But we cannot use our diagonal lemma to let a sentence tau be my negation is true, kind of thing. So we need a different diagonal lemma. We claim that such lemma is available with a few tweaks to our regular diagonal lemma. We're not going to go through this proof. But the point is, I can post the slides if you want to look at it later. The point is, we can get to the diagonal, a similar diagonal lemma that let tau be, tau, my negation is true, kind of thing, right? From there, a similar paradox to the liar occurs. And we can get to the empty sequence. In fact, we can do this to any other sentences, not just the liar. We can do it to a carry sentence. Instead of saying, if I am true, then absurdity follows, we can say, it is true that absurdity follows from me, kind of sentence. We just need to tweak the diagonal lemma. We can also have alternative carry that don't tweak the diagonal lemma, just alternative forms of carry, such as kappa is not true or absurdity, for example. Or it's not the case that kappa is true and not absurdity. So these are other forms, and there are partial negative modalities, and they work exactly like carry, right? We can also mix and match predicates. We don't have to use just the truth predicate on its own. We can use truth, provable, and knowable, for example, all together. And we try to find the partial negative modality using those predicates. So this one that says, it is known that it is provable that I am not true. And that's a paradoxical sentence. Here we use the other rules of T2, P2, and K2 to avoid cutting so much. We let pi be its partial negative modality using the diagonal lemma. We get, it's a long proof, we get to the empty sequence at the end, right? It is a liar-like sentence. And we don't have to stop there. We can use it for any predicate that we can give a story where they can fulfill the rules A and B. For example, the following predicates can be justified to have the rules A and B: undeniable, indisputable, unquestionable, obvious, definite, assertable, acceptable, and so on. And it's not surprising that you can get paradoxes from these predicates because they all share some properties with truth or factitude. As an example, undeniable, we can reason that if we can prove that snow is white, then we can prove that snow is white is undeniable because we have a proof for it. Phi is undeniable entails that phi, right? And then we can use partial negative modalities and diagonal lemma to get liar-like sentences or carry-like sentences. We also, in our recipe, we can also talk about truth tellers, not just paradoxes sentences or truth teller-like sentences. So instead of letting sentences be their partial negative modalities, we let them be their partial positive modalities. In that case, we get truth teller-like pathologies. So our recipe divides pathologies into two categories: the paradoxical ones using partial negative modality, and the non-paradoxical ones using partial positive modalities. So this is another advantage for the recipe compared to the enclosure schema, since the enclosure schema stays silent regarding non-paradoxical pathologies. Moreover, we're almost there, I promise. We can, the recipe itself accommodates pathological loops and can tell you when a loop is paradoxical or not. If you say, for example, if you have two sentences where they talk about each other's partial negative modality, then it's not paradoxical, because having two partial negative modalities is like double negation. So it's not paradoxical the same way I am not true is not paradoxical. So no matter how long the loop is, as long as you have an odd number of partial negative modalities, you're going to get a paradox. If you don't have an odd number of partial negative modalities, then it's going to be pathological, but not paradoxical. And you don't have to use, for example, truth teller and liar-like sentences. You can use any partial positive and partial negative modality. So A1 and B1 here, A1 uses B1's partial positive modality, while B1 uses A1's partial negative modality. This is paradoxical. Here, they talk about each other's partial negative modalities, It's not paradoxical. It's a truth teller-like sentence or loop. This is the proof of why A1 and A1 and B1 spark a paradox just like carry, while we don't have it for A2 and B2. Moreover, the recipe does not include the Sorites, right? The Sorites does not fit our recipe, and that's not surprising because the vague predicate on which the Sorites turns do not satisfy any of the clauses of the recipe. The rules A and B do not apply to a vague predicate such as bold or tall. Moreover, unsurprisingly, the Sorites paradox does not involve using the diagonal lemma to let a sentence be its partial negative modality, since it doesn't involve any self-reference. So it's not in the same family as the liar and the carry and the provability liar and so on. So we can conclude on what does the recipe suggest in terms of solutions? Well, it might be obvious by now, but modifying the T schema would not provide a uniform solution. That is because one would need different justification to modify all the rules of the other predicates as well. Similarly, if we take a hierarchical approach or a singularity approach, we would need separate justification for each predicate, right? I'm not saying that these approaches are ruled out, but they are not straightforward as, for example, if we restrict cut or reject cut, or if we restrict or reject contraction, right? If we do restrict or reject cut or contraction, then we would be providing one solution to different paradoxes because those appear in every single paradox. I personally restrict cut where the cut formula is grounded. So instead of getting rid of cut completely, I only restrict it to grounded sentences, but that's a topic for another time. Thank you for listening.